So first of all, thanks to Gloria and everybody else for inviting me down. As she said, my job title, I wish I was paid by the length of it. Technically, it is the Assistant Chief of Economic and Labor Market Information for the Vermont Department of Labor. In short, our division is the economic division of the department, and my role is primarily to go around, probably half of my job is to go around and talk to people about the economy in Vermont. We talk to businesses, we talk to industry folks, we talk to policymakers. We talk to a lot of young people who are trying to find information about entering the career, starting their career and all that. And we also talk to a lot of older people who are just interested and have an interest in how the economy is doing in Vermont. And I'm actually, as I was driving down here, I realized that I'm proud to say that this is the second time that I've spoken to a group of these lifelong learner groups. I spoke to one up in Burlington many years ago in a past life about a completely different topic. It was a lot of fun, and I hope we have some fun here today too. I am reminded, as we start to talk about this, that economists don't really have a good reputation as good speakers. Most economists, I think when most people think of economists, if you remember the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you think of the teacher in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I think more of the teacher on Peanuts, the wah, 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 because that's about as much credit as economists usually get when they try to predict things, because usually when we try to predict things, we get it wrong. So the good news is I'm not here today to predict anything. What I'm here to do today is share information that we already know to be true, not much about. You might get me to answer a couple questions about where we're headed, but my role is not to forecast, it is to just provide the information. And first, let's talk about who we are, the Economic and Labor Market Information, wrong button. The Economic and Labor Market Information Division. We are housed in the Department of Labor, but 100% federally funded, primarily through agency or bureau called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Raise your hand if you have ever visited the website of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. A couple of you, yeah, you probably got lost. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the primary federal bureau that analyzes the labor market. And they look at, if you heard last month that the unemployment rate was 3.8% and that 219,000 jobs were created, that's the Bureau of Labor Statistics producing that. They produce information about who's in the labor force, about what jobs these people have, about what their wages are, and they also measure inflation. We are the state level version of the BLS. They fund us to create the state level data that uses the same formulas that the federal data does. So we collect all the state level data for them, and we collect it, we analyze it, and then we go around and talk about it. So that is my role. I love the job, and I hope what I have to share with you today you might find interesting as well. If you don't find it interesting at all, you'll be just like most of the students I teach at UVM, and I'm used to it, so it's no big deal. But so we have been told as economists that we are boring and that we talk too much and that we should have we should engage people in conversation. So for the next 45 seconds or so, we're going to engage you in a quiz that hopefully will make you think, wow, this is going to be interesting as we go along further, and then you'll be disappointed and we'll move on. What's the population of Vermont? Anyone know? 600. So who said 700,000? 600. Right, so the person who said 700,000, I like that answer because in the year 2000, the Census Bureau had their population projections, and they had us at 700,000 by now. They were not right. The population is right now, as far as we know, approximately, give or take, 623,000. How many cities in the U.S. have a population greater than Vermont? Lots, 27 of them. So when we talk about Vermont as a state, when we go to national conferences, and there's people from Texas and California who all do this, they kind of laugh when we talk about our population because it's tiny and they live in suburbs that are larger, but whatever. But as I was driving down here, by the way, today, on these back roads, because my phone sent me on some crazy dirt roads, which is great, but I was thinking to myself, I know there's only 600,000 people here, and I kind of like that, right? So how many cities in the US, and then what percent of Vermont's population is found in Chittenden County, which some say is not part of the state anyway? 26% in 2007. It was 25% in 2010. It's 26%. You all are doing very well with this quiz. The next question, which of these are towns in Vermont? Is Albany a town in Vermont? Yes. Yes? Is Troy a town in Vermont? Yes. Yes. Raise your hand if you think Athens is a town in Vermont. Yes. It is. Halifax? Yes. Yes. Toronto? No. Anybody think Toronto? Y'all are good at this game. Montgomery? Yes. Yes. Wow. And Baltimore? Yes. Yes. Well, that was no fun. So for that reason, well, we'll do this one real quick. Is Vermont above or below the US in per capita income? We're above in per capita income. These are, by the way, you're going to see different numbers later, and it's not because we're lying to you. It's because the base number, the year of the real base is different. And if that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. Just try to believe me when I say I'm not lying to you. Income is higher in Vermont than the US by just a little bit. Average hourly wage is a little bit lower, average hourly wage, but median hourly wage is a little bit higher. We have a more compressed wage scale than the rest of the country. And we also have more income from sources other than labor, which is what drives our per capita income up above the nation as a whole as well. So that ends the interactive portion of the evening. I do want to say, though, if you want to interrupt and ask questions, I really, honestly, 100% don't mind. I'll leave time for questions at the end, but if there's some shiny thing you want to talk about as I'm going through this, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or do like my students do and just shout out your question, whatever it may be. I'm happy to address any questions you have. So people always ask us, how's the economy doing in Vermont? How is the economy doing in Vermont right now? So-so. It's amazing. How can you say anything but amazing? It is. The unemployment rate is what? Anyone know? 2.8%. That graph in the back that is covered up by the slide there, that's gross state product, which is basically the amount of stuff we produce in this state. You can see that first line is the year 2000. It's going up and up and up. So clearly everything is great in this state, right? Yeah.
Do you think it's really fair to be using UI3 when you're quoting a 2.8%?
We'll talk about that later. I do think it's fair, but we'll talk about why a little bit later. So I'm done here because the economy in Vermont is doing amazing, and if I go any further, I'm going to have to explain the difference between the U3 and the U5 and the U6. But to look at a little more detail, maybe things aren't perfect. Oh, wrong button again. Let's first look at the labor force, and this is not this isn't the data that most people look at, but this is a look at what constitutes the labor force in Vermont. Who are the people that are in the labor force? And when we talk about that, all of this data is generated from something called the Current Population Survey. And the Current Population Survey, very brief background, monthly survey, 60,000 households nationwide, 1,200 households in Vermont, representing about 2,700 people because the average household in Vermont has 2.4 or something people in it. So 1,200 households representing about 2,700 people. They get asked a long series of questions. Who wants to play along with me as we do a little sample of that? Somebody want to be my respondent? So what's your first name?
Steve.
Steve. So Steve, this is how we determine the employment situation of people who are on the survey. Steve, are you currently employed?
No.
Have you sought work in the past 4 weeks?
No.
Okay, so already we know that Steve is out of the labor force because he's not actively seeking work and he's not currently working. If he was currently working, he would be employed. If he had actively sought work in the past 4 weeks, and a couple other small caveats, like he's actually able to work and willing to work, then he would be unemployed. But in Steve's situation, he's neither of those. He's out of the labor force. There's a whole bunch of questions on this survey, but that's the basic structure of how we determine sort of which pot people fall into. Are they out of the labor force, in the labor force? Are they employed, unemployed? And it's done monthly. And when we do that, what we find is that in Vermont, the labor force is about 56% of the population. So 44% of Vermonters are not working or actively seeking work. So that's this half over here. What's that?
Is that age related?
Say that again?
Is that age related, or is that from age zero?
Oh, this is everybody, right? This is kids under 16 and people over 65. This is everyone. So 44% of the population is out of the labor force. And sometimes people think, wow, that's a huge portion of the population that's not working, although amongst a group of retired people, maybe that doesn't seem like such a huge number. But relative to other states, that number is actually really high. In some of the poorer states in the South, that number, instead of being 44% of people out of the labor force, that number can be as high as 46% of people out of the labor force. So people in the labor force, 56% of them, and of those in the labor force right now, 97.2, technically, 97.2% of them are employed, and the balance of those, the 2.8%, are the unemployed. So if we look a little bit more closely at this, we can break down people who are working into people who are working part-time and people who are working full-time. Yeah, Steve?
Can you go back to the previous slide for a second?
Yes.
So the pie chart on the left, 56% of the Vermont population is in the labor force.
Yep.
What is the national average?
Slightly lower than that. It's probably 50. I'm just ballparking here. Probably 52, 51, 52. It's right around half, just above half. Some states are well below. Vermont, states in New England tend to be higher. And states with very young populations tend to be higher as well for obvious reasons. So we're a little bit above in that regard, which is generally considered a good outcome. Yeah?
Do you account, and how do you account for people in the cash economy?
Well, remember, this is based on a phone survey.
Right.
So the question is, have you worked for money in the during the week of the 12th, but don't worry about that. Basically, did you work for income this month? And that is up to the respondent, right? So if you are a gig economy worker and you drive for Uber all the time, and you Airbnb, it's really up to you. So the person asks you, did you work for money? I think most Uber drivers would probably say yeah, unless they're trying to hide it, right? So that's always a problem in the survey. Underground economy stuff doesn't bubble up much because people who earn money selling drugs don't usually tell the government all about how successful they've been at doing that. So, but of the people who are working full-time of the people who are working in Vermont, about 20% of them are working part-time. And that number is also a little bit lower than the that number is a little bit lower than the national average. And what we find is that also lower than the national average is the portion of those people working part-time who are doing so for economic reasons. So you can be working part-time for a whole host of reasons, but we break it down into two different reasons. One is economic reasons, and what that means is that you want to work full-time, but the economy is not providing a full-time position for you at this time. You cannot find full-time employment. That, for the labor market, is a negative outcome. The rest of the people working part-time, the other 91%, are working part-time either because they truly just wish to work part-time, they're independently wealthy, they whatever, or they're working part-time because of struggles with daycare, or for whatever reason they have something else going on, they're carrying 2 part-time jobs instead of 1 full-time job, whatever the reason may be. It's not strictly because the economy won't provide a full-time job for them. So we separate them out into part-time for economic reasons and part-time for non-economic reasons. Just one second. And the part-time for economic reasons is a tiny slice in Vermont these days. That number was a lot larger. If we had this conversation in 2010, instead of being 9% of part-time workers, it would have been probably 25, 27% of part-time workers. Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, how do you define part-time?
34, well, under 35 hours. 34 hours or less. I can't remember if it's under 35 or 34 or less, but yep. Yeah.
Yeah, it says part-time for non-economic reasons, but some of the reasons you gave were so economic.
Right. Yeah. So let me try to be a little more specific. The problem is not the economy. That the problem is not that there's not enough economic output for that person to have a full-time job. That is what the BLS, and therefore we, because, well, frankly, because they pay me. So, but that is my definition, right, of what a non-economic reason is. So, certainly, childcare, it would be an economic reason for a lot of people, right? But for the purposes of this, and what we're really trying to understand is the difference between people who are working part-time because there's nothing there for them, which is the part that can be fixed with a change in the economy, versus people who are working part-time because of some other challenge that they are facing. That might be for them an economic challenge, but it's not the economy as a whole that is holding them back. Let's try it another way. If the economy got better, those people would still be working part-time. If picking your kid up from school is what makes you work part-time, it doesn't matter how good the economy gets. You're still going to be working part-time. Yeah?
Would you consider the problem that people have with the health care benefits cliff an economic reason or non-economic reason for work?
For the purposes of this, it is a non-economic reason. For the purposes here. There's no judgment put on the, well, yeah, there's no judgment put on the term. There's all sorts of reasons why you could be working part-time. And the one that the BLS cares about the most, although they ask, so there's other data available. You can find out how many people are working part-time because of childcare if you want. But in terms of generating this data, the primary thing they're looking for is people working part-time because they can't find full-time work, because the economy won't provide that for them. The other part of this is that 44% of the people who are out of the labor force, we mentioned them earlier, why they're out of the labor force. And this is, if you were paying attention during the election, you might have heard that there's 94 million people have left the labor force, or some statistic like that. What we're referring to here is this portion of people who are out of the labor force for whatever reason, and they are made up of people who are out of the labor force for good reason. Steve is retired. Retired, Steve, is that fair enough? Yeah. So retired, that Steve doesn't want to work. He's in the situation he wants to be, and that's a good economic outcome for him. Young kids, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. I have a 6-year-old. I need to update my thing because she's now 6, and she'd be very upset with me if my intro, she knew I called her 5 years old in my intro, but my 6-year-old daughter, obviously not in the labor force yet, as much as we've tried. Then there's a whole host of people that aren't at one extreme of the age spectrum or the other, who are not working for a whole host of reasons. They're not working because they're staying home with their children. They're not working because they are independently wealthy. Whatever reason they have, they're going to college. They went back to school, whatever that may be. But then there's a wedge of them, these 3,487 right here, those people are people who are what we call marginalized. They're not considered in the labor force. They have sought work in the past year, but are not currently looking for work because they don't think there's a job for them. Some of them are what we call discouraged. They have just given up looking. And some of them have decided that they need to go get additional short-term training of some sort, or they need to go do something before they re-enter the labor market. They want a job, they just can't find it right now, and they've given up looking for now.
How does the seasonality of work in a number of Vermont industries come into play here?
So right here, it doesn't come into play at all, because if you look at the bottom of this, it says August 2018 current population survey, 12-month average, which removes obviously any seasonality from it. So what you're looking at here is not seasonal. What we see if we look closely enough is that the peak months for employment in Vermont are August and December, right? And then we see, I think between December and March, we expect to lose, don't quote me on this, we have a camera rolling, so, but I think it's something like 5,000 jobs between December, when all the holiday hiring comes to an end after the holidays, and then by March, when all the ski areas close in April, about 5,000 swing, and then it bounces back up for summer. And people move in and out of the labor force all the time during that, because there's a not insignificant number of people who work ski areas in the winter and summer recreation employment in the summer, and have those two shoulders where there's a good chance that they're not in the labor force. They're not even looking for work. They're just waiting for the next one to start up. That's what I did when I first got out of college. So when we put all of that together, we get nice charts like this, which show you the labor force, that top blue line here. I'm going to step up here and point to this a little better, but this top blue line here is the size of the labor force, and the line below it is employed. So the difference between the two, if the labor force consists of those who are employed and those who are unemployed, then the difference between the blue line and the red line is the number of people unemployed. And you can see the labor force grew, and we're going to look at this more later, but the labor force grew actually going back to 1948 when we first started collecting this data. And the labor force peaked in January of 2009, but employment in Vermont, peaked in April of 2006. So the recession that started nationwide in December of 2007 actually started to creep up in Vermont a little bit earlier than that. Since the recession, employment has bounced back somewhat, but the labor force is still significantly smaller, about 13,000, 13,000, is that right? Yeah, give or take 13,000 than it was when the recession started. A pretty steep decline in the labor force. We'll talk about that a little bit later, why that might be. This gets to, what's your first name, if you don't mind? Sharon. So Sharon said, do you think the U3 is really a good measure, which is tuned me into the fact that we have somebody who's very knowledgeable about labor market information. This red line here is the traditional measure of unemployment. And what that is a measure of specifically is the percentage of the labor force who have not found work, who have actively sought work but not found it in the past month. So 3.1% have, well, now it's 2.8 because that's 2017 annual average. 2.8% of people in Vermont who are either working or actively seeking work can't find a job. That is a terrible outcome for 2.8% of Vermonters. Macroeconomically speaking, that number is very, very low. The national number is closer to 2.8 or 3.8, well, it is 3.8%. And historically, the unemployment rate in Vermont has rarely been this low. Before the 1980s, it was never this low. And since the 1980s, it's been down to this level just a couple times. So in that sense, the labor market in Vermont is doing very well. But we have this problem in the labor force getting smaller. This line above it is something called the U5. Remember I mentioned marginalized workers, people who have sort of given up or have stepped out of the labor market because they can't find a job and they're going to go get a little training or something. Those people are included in the U5. So that orange line where you see that the rate peaked out in 2009, this orange line is the U5. So you take all of the unemployed people, add the marginalized people, and you get 7.5%. And if you remember correctly, a few minutes ago we talked about people who were working part-time for economic reasons. Those people, we consider that a poor outcome, economic outcome for those people. Those people are included in the broadest measure we have, which is the U6. The U6 is not, by any normal definition, an unemployment rate because it includes people who are employed. But it is a measure of, it's the broadest measure of what we call labor market underutilization, which means there are people who are working part-time that want to work full-time. They are being underutilized. Their skills, their knowledge, their abilities are not being put to maximum use in the labor market. That's a bad outcome for them and a bad outcome for the economy. And you can see, if we use that measure, the U6 peaked at 12.5% in 2010. It actually went a little higher than that on a quarterly basis. We only collect this on a quarterly basis statewide because the sample is too small. But peaked at about 12.5. Nationwide, it peaked at about 18%. Vermont's economy in this recession and the 2001 recession, both, Vermont's economy came out of them in much better shape than the nation as a whole, which created this meme that's going around that Vermont always has less of a drop during a recession. Like we're smoother, basically. We have less a drop and we don't grow quite as fast. And this meme, this thought, this notion, this idea is brilliant as long as you only go back to 2001. Because if you go back to 1991, the whole story falls apart because the 1991 recession was far worse in Vermont than it was in the nation as a whole. And the early 80s recession was equally bad. So it's a nice story to tell. We tell ourselves that to make us feel better about when the next recession is coming or something. So the unemployment rate that you hear on the news every month is the U3. And people say, well, is it a perfect measure? It's a perfect measure of exactly what it is calculating, which is that 2.8% of people, with an error range of 0.5 point in each direction, but with 2.8% of people in Vermont, give or take 0.5 point, who want a job, currently can't find one, who have looked for work in the past month, can't find a job or are working. So that's what it measures. It's not the best economic indicator overall, but it's a decent measure of that. And if you put that together with the U5 and the U6, there's also a U4, there's a U1, there's a U2. They sold a lot of albums. But we don't talk, the U1 and U2 are pretty pointless, and the U4 is just a sub-measure of the U5. So anyway, we talk about these. Primarily the U3 is the one you hear about, and it's a perfectly fine measure of exactly what it measures and nothing more.
I have a question. Is that want a job or want the type of job that they want?
No, these are people, I was a little loose with my language. These are people who have actively sought work in the past month. That's the definition. So some people actively seek work, get job offers, and turn them down, right? In a good economy, that happens all the time. So those people are still considered unemployed because they're turning down good jobs, right? There's no survey that I'm aware of that asks how many good jobs did you turn down. And then you have to define what good is, right? But anyway, in a bad economy, people take any job. In a good economy like right now, I have students who are graduating and turning down jobs that I would have killed for when I was graduating college, right? But that's the economy they're graduating into. I started teaching in 2008. It was a very different conversation with students. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Break any of these statistics down by segments in the state?
Yes.
So I would expect southern Vermont's numbers to look considerably different than northern Vermont.
Yes, and we have it by county, by labor market area, which is basically like a watershed of labor where people go. So like Burlington is the hub of a whole bunch of labor that's around of the labor market. We have it by labor market area. We have it by county. We have it by CTE, Career Technical Ed Centers. And then we also have it by town. And I caution you when you're using town level data, town's over 1,000 people. When you're using town level data, sometimes the error range is greater than the unemployment rate itself. So, yeah.
Again, are these figures gathered from phone interviews? Sure.
Yeah, so the basic data is gathered from phone surveys of 1,200 households, 2,700 Vermont or something like that. But when you get down to the level of the state, nationwide, that's what drives it. 60,000 households, you just crunch the data, you get your numbers. At the state level and sub-state level, there are other inputs into the model. And one of the inputs into the model is unemployment insurance claims. So that if the CPS data tells us one thing, and we get a whole bunch of claims showing up because, well, I won't mention any names, but some large manufacturer lays off a bunch of people or something, that claims data goes into the formula as well. So there's, at the state and sub-state level, there's more inputs than just that. There's also historic population data, historic labor data through census that gets pulled into it as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, don't people have to, when they have unemployment insurance, don't they have to be looking for a job, isn't it?
Yes, but in that sense, that's not how they come into, well, here's another way of looking at it. There are about probably 3,000 open unemployment insurance claims being paid out each week. There are about 10,000 unemployed persons in Vermont, according to our data. You can be, if you are filing a claim, you are unemployed, but you do not have to be filing a claim to be unemployed by our definition. And the majority of people who, by our definition, are unemployed are not filing a claim. So we don't use claims data specifically to determine the number of unemployed. Yes?
When you say that the end number of Vermont looks pretty good, if you factor in the possibility that the population decline, which I recall is 13,000, left the state to go find jobs elsewhere because they couldn't find them here, is that built into a net conclusion? The economy looks good?
Well,
the economy's got problems, or?
So, if I said anything to that effect, I misspoke. There are 13,000 fewer people in the labor force, but that does not indicate that 13,000 people left the state. Mainly what it indicates is that about 13,000 people have reached retirement age. That's the bulk of the decline in the labor force is Steve. I know. That's the bulk of it. And in terms of people coming in, I should have brought the slide about this. In terms of people leaving the state and entering the state, I will only say this one time, and then we'll move on because I don't want to wrap up the entire discussion on this. But that is a thing we tell ourselves that is not supported by data. The number, just one second. More people moved into Vermont last year than moved out. Our problem is not a mass migration of people leaving. A lot of young people leave the state. It's a small state. They want to go explore somewhere else. But a lot of people move into the state as well. The labor force decline is not generated by that. It's population dynamics. And we'll talk about those population dynamics in a few minutes. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm going to dovetail on what the gentleman just said.
Sure.
And my friend over here just commented she was surprised that, people are moving to Vermont. And as you well know, I know you know this, that Allied Van Lines does a survey every year of states where people leave and where people come. And guess which ranked number one?
Vermont.
Exactly. But does that offset the people that have left the state to find employment in other places?
So, well, as it turns out, it does. But let me caution you just a little bit. There are two sources of information about net migration of people. There's a census survey that is scientifically done of literally hundreds of thousands of households. And there's an Allied Van Line survey that looks at moving trucks. And Vermont imports more college students than most states, and college students rent vans and bring their stuff in them. I mean, the governor loved that statistic, right? But
Right, but to follow up on that question, do those college students eventually enter the labor force in the state of Vermont?
So that is actually a question we don't know the answer to. We'd love to know the answer to it, and we could find the answer to it if colleges would give us the social security numbers of the students.
Good luck.
Right. So, but it's like one of those things, people say, we can't know that. We can know that, but in order to know it, there's only one line item on a person that tracks them through their whole lives that we can confidently say doesn't change, except for the bizarre exceptions, and that is your social security number. We can do all sorts of stuff with social security data, but we don't have access to it. So we get these vague comments from universities that, according to their information, which they may or may not have done scientifically, 20% of students stay or something. But remember, a university like UVM's concern is, if I tell you that 80% of students who graduate from UVM leave the state, people will go, oh my gosh, we're losing all the students. Well, 80% of the students who go to UVM are from out of the state to begin with, right? So of course 80% leave the state. So universities aren't too keen on sharing that. But again, it's an answerable question. We just, yeah.
You're giving us graphs of labor, but how about graphs of the job market? There are plenty of places around here where they're advertising for jobs and they can't fill them. Employers are having huge difficulty filling jobs.
Absolutely. And that is how you know we are in 2018, not 2008. The market has really flipped. And now employers can't find the talent they need. Believe me, 10 years ago, that was not the conversation being had. Employers were not worried about finding talent. They were worried about finding business. And now we have, it's a pretty serious problem with a lot of employers in the state. Even employers who have raised, and the first reaction from any economist is, well, you're just not paying enough. Well, a lot of employers in this state have raised, it hasn't shown up across the board, but have raised wages to try to attract labor, and they struggle to do it. That is in part because there's not enough young people in the state, and that is not a migration problem. That is a me problem, because my generation, bleeding over into your generation, didn't make enough kids. The baby boomer generation, their parents made lots and lots of kids. But the generation after the late baby boomers and then fading into my generation, we didn't have a lot of kids. It went from something like average household size of, 4.2 to 2.67 nationwide. That's a serious drop in fertility rates. So that's the problem now, right? Businesses are really struggling to find labor because there's not a huge core of young people out there looking for work. So
is that the reason, despite all this good news, that the state is trying to pay people to come? It's the demographics they're trying to.
There is I don't want to address the specific proposal to pay people to move here. I will say this, there is a very significant focus at the policy level trying to find ways to attract young people to come here to stay here. There's one proposal which actually, make of it what you will, but which is to tell young people that you don't pay state income taxes until you're 30. And then it makes it like New Hampshire, except that part about being 30, right? But there are all sorts of ideas to pull young people in. The problem is that a lot of states are dealing with this, and every state wants to attract young people. There's not enough young people to attract. Well, domestically there's not. And we're not going to, it appears we're not going to be trying to bring in people from overseas. So states are left to fend for themselves to try to attract young people, because we can't fix what created the problem in the first place, which is we didn't have enough children, right? Yeah.
I'm going to dovetail again on what the gentleman said, and I'm aware of, the $10,000 offer that's on the table for, let's say, I'm living in Arkansas, and I suddenly moved to Vermont, and I operate some business out of my basement with a computer, with a terminal on my roof and all that kind of stuff. One of the biggest employers, as you well know in the state of Vermont, are the universities, colleges. We have a bevy of young people, talented young people, and they go. Are there, what is the alternative to attracting one person to come here and pay them 10 grand, and to attracting a business that's actually going to stay here, start here, and generate 2, 3, 4, 500 jobs?
Right. So in my role as an economist with the Vermont Department of Labor, I'm not a policymaker, right? And in my head, I'm like, we could try this, but I'm not a policymaker. We inform policy, we don't create it. If you give us a policy, we'll give you an estimate on it, right? But
has anybody given you a policy?
No, because they have economists at higher pay grades who do.
Again, I don't want to take up your time, but this gentleman made a point that we're paying people, one person, it could be 2, it could be 5, whatever.
Yeah.
But we have a potential labor force
Yep.
that is highly educated,
Right.
that at some point, after 4 or 5 years or whatever, gone.
Right. So one solution to that is to reorient the way we do these to encourage people graduating from college to stay, right? But that's policy, and I'm really not trying to. It's a very important question, and it's not one that I can speak to. You raise a very important point. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on this thought. I think there's a misunderstanding about this proposed program or the program. They don't get paid $10,000. They get up to $10,000 of expenses reimbursed to establish, get here and establish a business that also has potential to patent.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's states all around the union, especially in the Northeast, are trying to find creative ways. And for some reason, that one really hit the radar nationally. People in Oregon were talking about it. But Oregon has all sorts of, states all over. New York State will do all sorts of things to attract you to come there, right? For some reason, that one really hit the news. Real brief interlude to talk about wages and income, because we don't talk about wages and income very much in the state. Somebody asked about southern Vermont being a little bit different than the nation, or than Vermont as a whole. And that is true both in per capita income. I chose Bennington County, but I could have chosen any county in the South. Per capita income is a lot lower. Well, not a lot, I'm sorry. Annual average wage is a lot lower. Per capita income is somewhat lower in the southern half of the state. And that is I think that's the end of my brief interlude. Oh no. And then if you compare it to the nation as a whole, if you see Vermont was, for many years, slightly less well off than the nation as a whole in terms of per capita income, and in recent years has surpassed it but tracked very closely. And one thing we always like to emphasize is that Vermont is a very small fish in a very large pool. It's not surprising at all that our data tracks very closely to the national data because we are very small portion of that. And we are not, while we like to think of ourselves as being very different, we're not all that different than the nation as a whole. I'm going to move through this section quickly and then get to what I think you might be the most interested in. But let me first take a second to pause on this chart. And this chart, which is probably hard to interpret because it's filled with color, this is the red line is the recession we just experienced. And as you can see, we lost about 6% of our labor force. No, we lost about 6% of employment, not the labor force. So we woke up one day in 2009 with 6% fewer jobs than we had in 2006 nationwide. And it took us about 80 months to recover all of those jobs nationwide. That is a very steep decline and a very long recovery period. That is why we call it the Great Recession, although just for reference, because people always say it was the worst recession since the Great Depression. That's true, but if we had to put the Great Depression on here, we'd need a screen that's a lot larger because we lost about 30% of the jobs during the Great Depression. So there's really no comparison, even though we use that. We do compare the two. There's no comparison between what happened now and what happened in 1930. The troubling thing about this chart is that it's showing the amount of loss going down and how long it took to recover going across. And this is the 2007 recession. And this is the 2001 recession. And this is the 1990 recession. And this is the 1981 recession. You'll notice that for some reason that is not wholly understood, the length of time to recover jobs seems to be getting longer and longer, regardless of how deep the recession is. It is truly, we invented a term for it during the last recession, the 2001 recession. We call it the jobless recovery, and it's becoming more and more true. GDP bounces back, production bounces back, employment is much slower to bounce back. In Vermont, this is what I was talking about earlier. We had a slightly less dip. We only lost about 4% of employment, and we crossed the even line about the same time as the nation as a whole. But since then, Vermont has been growing more slowly than the rest of the nation in terms of employment. And then we break Vermont out into the different areas in Vermont. And the blue line is the United States, so you can kind of ignore that. The purple line is the Burlington Nectar, which is Chittenden County, Franklin County, most of Grand Isle, a couple random towns, basically the labor market area around Burlington. Burlington experienced tremendous growth during the recovery period. And the state as a whole, if you subtract Burlington from it, is actually still below where it was when the recession started. So if you remove the Burlington Nectar, basically if you remove northwest Vermont, you end up below where you were when the recession started. This is the rural-urban divide. This same chart, if you applied it to New York State and used New York City and then the rest of the state, urban areas have seen substantial growth and rural areas have seen continued decline. And when you look at the 2016 election, it explains part of it. Yeah?
How come they never include farm jobs?
Because farm jobs are very hard to, well, in short, because this is based primarily on unemployment insurance data, and very few farms are part of the unemployment insurance program. So, and also, farm jobs are, you can't just count payrolls because a lot of times it's families. Like, so if a whole family works on a farm, you could say that that's 5 employees, but they're not reporting that to anyone really, right? They're not like, your kids are working on the farm. That's what they do. So ag employment is really hard to track. So we don't deal with things that are hard to track. So anyway, so one takeaway from this chart that I've always had is that urban areas are driving the growth. Burlington is driving the growth. But interestingly, and this will be the Debbie Downer portion of the evening, this blue, if you take this previous chart and you just go to the last few months, to the past 2 years, basically 2 years, and you look a little more closely, you will find that the nation as a whole has continued to grow. And the state of Vermont is flat. Rural areas have added just a little bit, and Burlington has lost about 2,000 jobs. So this decline, which at first we just assumed was statistical noise because that's not uncommon in a month-to-month survey to have statistical noise, has gone from being statistical noise to being concerning. And if you're wondering, like, well, does it mean that the rest of the nation is going to go with Burlington? Probably not. But we do know that Vermont led the nation in the last recession and the one prior to that. It was a leading indicator. And we know that this cooling off of the Burlington labor market is, to us, concerning, because it had been the driver of growth in recent years, and now it's suddenly not. So we will watch that closely. There is always a chance, because of the way these programs work, that come March, I will come back and do a presentation to you and tell you that all of that stuff got washed away in statistical noise and it's fine now. We were confident of that the first couple months that it went down. Now we're starting to wonder if, no, actually this might be a real world concern. So that's the sad part of the evening.
What do you attribute that to?
We can't attribute to anything yet. The one thing we can tell you is that the industries it's in, we have that information, and manufacturing's lost about 900. It's right in front of us. There we go. Construction is also off. I don't remember what the other ones are in the Burlington area, but it's been a pretty general decline. Yeah.
In the job creation in Burlington, does that include the people who are their own one or two person startups, or are they not counted because they may be self-employed instead of employed by someone?
So they are counted, but estimated. They are not, they're not counted, but an estimate of their employment is included in the count, right? So they have some pretty good models to estimate, because you can look at tax records and other things, but it's not perfect. But they are included. Self-employed are included in the information there. If you look at what has happened in the state since the recession, surprising to no one, manufacturing has declined. Non-durable goods manufacturing, which is in Vermont, is a host of items, but mainly food and beer, has actually increased, but that's been heavily offset by steep declines in durable goods manufacturing. So manufacturing continues to decline, whereas professional and business services, attorneys, doctors, people who provide services for other businesses, biologists, a whole host of technical positions and highly educated, highly paid positions have grown a lot. And of course, it's Vermont. Leisure and hospitality continues to grow as well. And we don't see any decline in that in the near future. Yeah?
This is a little bit confusing even to me trying to frame the question, but the data seems to indicate that we're not doing too badly.
Mm-hmm.
The data is skewed such that northwest portion of the state is doing much better than southern Vermont. When I go to the northwest portion of the state, I see a much more robust infrastructure than we have here.
Yep.
And it seems to me that the southern portion of the state is neglected by state government when it comes to infrastructure, roads, communications, all that kind of stuff. To your knowledge, is this being taken into account when they look at how well we're doing when the southern part of the state is not really doing that well?
I should have brought a different presentation. I have a different presentation, and I'd be happy to send it to you actually if you want, that looks at the southern portion of the state versus the state as a whole and a whole bunch of metrics. And the southern portion of the state is in worse shape. Higher unemployment rates, more decline in labor force, lower incomes. In terms of infrastructure development and all that, I don't, we just present, again, I hate to sound like I'm avoiding your question, but we don't inform, we just inform policy, we don't write it, right? So I don't know what the government, I don't know what people outside of labor are doing about it. It's certainly a concern. I mean, the executive branch is well aware that the southern part of the state, but I don't know what plans they have for it. I want to get to, and I know that we're starting to run short on time, but I want to get to something that, well, no, we're not going to look at that or that. I want to look at a couple things that, and I'll try to do it in like 5 minutes, that I think are interesting headwinds that Vermont faces. And one of those is something we've already talked about. I'm sorry, I should have made those numbers larger. But if you take the population in 2000, since the year 2000, the population of people 65 plus has increased, well, this is indexed from 100 to 145, so basically by 45%. The population of people 65 plus has increased by 45%. That is not because we've become a hotbed of places people want to go to retire. It's because a whole lot of people that in 2000 were 45 to 65, by 2018 become people who are 65 to 85, right? This is not migration of people. This is aging of people. The population of 0 to 19-year-olds is 84% of what it was in 2000, right? And again, my generation didn't have enough kids, which by the way is mainly a joke, right? There's a whole host of reasons. Anyway, and then the population, the working age population, basically 25 to 64-year-olds, 20 to 64-year-olds, this population is pretty much flat since 2000. And what that leads us to is a change in the working age population here versus the portion of the population who is supported by that working age population. So people who are under the age where they're in the labor force, people under 18 basically, or under 20, are supported by people who are working. Their tax revenue goes to funding schools and all that kind of stuff. And then people who are over 65, most of them are getting money through a trust, right, that they paid into, but it's money that's coming out of tax revenue. So that we call this the, I can't think of the name, the dependency ratio. The portion of the population that is working is expected to decline by about 10% between 2000 and 2030. And that 10% decline still needs to produce the same amount of output to keep incomes, to keep standard of living where it is. I'm going to do these last few slides quickly so I can answer more questions. But the labor force participation rate, which is the portion of the population, of working age population, that is either actively seeking work or working. In the 1950, 87% of men were in the labor force, and that number has declined nowadays to about 70%. The trend on the female side is very well understood. After World War II, women started entering the labor force, two-parent working families. And so as women entered the labor force, their labor force participation rate went up and up and up. It got within about 10 points of males before the year 2000, when it as well started to decline. So there's all sorts of explanations of why the labor force participation rate would be declining. And I'm going to look at 3 age cohorts and briefly touch on why that might be. This is people 55 and over. Remember the scale here, 42% down to 27%. So it's not as dramatic as it might look. But from the 50s until the 90s, there was a steep decline in the labor force participation rate of people 55 plus. This is because of a wealth effect where we created a middle class that had this thing called retirement, had this thing called Social Security benefits. So people could actually afford to retire. Nobody alive in the 1920s, 1910s, 1850s was saying, what am I going to do with the last 20 years of my life? Because they were going to work until they died. Post-World War II, we created enough wealth that people could retire. Now you might say, okay, Kevin, so in 1990 we lost all that wealth. Is that what happened? No. What has happened here, there's a host of explanations, but the most obvious explanation is that the nature of work has changed. pretty dramatically in the past 30 years. There's much less manufacturing, which requires a lot of physical ability. There's not as much construction, which requires a lot of physical ability. There's not as much mining, physical ability. More jobs nowadays are desk jobs or brain-oriented, thought-oriented jobs that people can stay in longer. So that's the one basic explanation. That, yeah.
I think there's another factor which is at least as important, which is if you look at the life expectancy of a person age 55 in 1950, and you looked at the life expectancy of a person age 55 today, you get a very different picture. And so that period of retirement,
Yes.
the fear of it being so much longer, and I think since 1990, you're seeing a dramatic impact because of all the advances in healthcare.
Very, very good observation. I need to remember that next time I present, and I will attribute it to Steve. What town are you from, Steve? Can I ask what town you're from?
It depends what time of year you ask the question.
Okay, fair enough. I will say Steve from a town in southern Vermont, but no, that's a really good observation. So this is 55 plus, somewhat well understood. This is 16 to 19-year-olds. Now, the jaggedness is summer employment, right? A lot of kids go to work in the summer. And the thing that's interesting here, pay no attention to the jaggedness, just look at the trend line. You'll see that even in the winter, about half of the people 16 to 19 had jobs in the 1980s, and that number's down to about 30. Part of what's happening here, we think, is again a wealth effect in that one thing is that young people don't need to be in the labor force as early. Another factor is that kids are doing other things that prepare them for college or life after high school. And if you think about kids getting summer jobs to pay for college, when I was in college, which was some time ago, but not all that long ago, I could have a summer job that would significantly impact the revenue I had for college. It wouldn't pay for college, it wouldn't pay it all off or anything, but it was significant enough to make a difference. Young people today, it doesn't do that. UVM, if you're from out of state, is $50,000 a year, $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 a year. No summer job is going to make a dent in that. So did you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
The last set of presentations you made have clearly indicated, at least to me, that there's going to be issues down the road as far as the labor force, at least. And you just made a point by saying that as a parent, if I send my kid, if I live in New Jersey and I send my kid to UVM, I'm paying 50 grand. You know, I've invested over $200,000 in my child education for 4 years. And you can multiply that by thousands of people at Middlebury, you can go on down the line. We have, again, and I'm repeating myself from earlier, we have a built-in, well-educated labor force who have chosen to come to Vermont, spend 4 or 5 years here, and they may want to live here.
Right.
What are the options for them? And have you made this presentation again to the policymakers?
Oh, yeah. The policymakers don't want to hear this anymore. No, right. No, but so part of the problem, though, is you can graduate a lot of highly educated college students, but you also need an entrepreneurial class that is creating jobs for them, and that's way outside my realm, right? But you need a dynamic market. Burlington did that with Dealer.com and My Web Grocer and all these. You know, they've created a hub of tech that convinces people to stay here. You need more of that, right? And getting to that is harder than educating the students, right? So I just want to, I'm happy to talk more about that. I also want to just get through this, and then if people want to stick around, I'll answer questions until my wife calls and says I really need to start driving home. So the other one that we talk about these days is the 25 to 54-year-olds, because this is really, that's a cute dog. This is really the heart of the labor force. And in recent years, after climbing and climbing and climbing, this is 25 to 54-year-olds, this is everybody. After climbing and climbing and climbing for decades, this has started to decline. And this is troubling because you could say, well, this is also a wealth effect. And there's probably some of that in there that, more people are getting PhDs, so they're not done by the time they're 25, and people are retiring early, but there's not that many people retiring at 54, right? There's just not that many. Not many guys started dealer.com, right? So the interesting thing here is we don't know what this decline is from, but we know that a not insignificant, a statistically significant portion of it is caused by the opioid epidemic. That a survey asking people about opioid use and employment demonstrates that there is a not insignificant portion of this decline, doesn't explain the whole decline, but it explains a portion of it, is from opioid addiction, which in the world of things we need to fix is a serious one. And it's obviously not what we do, but it could have a serious impact on our labor market in the future, especially if we could solve it, because we would have thousands of people who are working age, who would want to enter the labor force, who could be those entrepreneurs and create those companies. So that is 25 to 54-year-olds. And I just want to say a couple last things. One is that I usually have a nice slide at the end with all my contact information on it, and I usually type it up right before I start, and that's not there. So, and I don't have the button. So I don't have that. But also, I just wanted to take a quick second to say thank you again to Gloria and everybody else. And I loved all your questions, and I will answer any more that you might have. Yes?
As a small business owner who's looking to expand in different parts of the state, I know this is not part of this presentation,
Yeah.
the other one that you mentioned, northern and southern Vermont.
Yep.
Other than Chittenden County, what would you say are the best areas to start a small business right now?
Well, if you just look at job growth, because that's really the primary metric we have, there's Chittenden County, there's Washington County, but what we're really talking about there is Montpelier area, right? Barre, Montpelier. And I think I'm done. I honestly, I don't think, that doesn't mean you shouldn't start your business in Bennington or Brattleboro or whatever, but in terms of job growth, those are the drivers right now.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, with Bennington,
Yeah.
Brattleboro area, which is more
I could send you information on employment changes there. Both of them have been hit pretty hard, and I don't want to try to quote the data without knowing it, but it's at my fingertips, so yeah.
There was something, it may still be there, called the Southern Vermont Economic Development Zone.
Yes.
Which has been around for quite a while. Do you have any statistics about the impact that's had on the Southern Vermont economy?
I don't. I presented at the Southern Vermont Economic Development Conference, which was generated as part of that last year. But I don't know that anyone has tried to calculate what the impact of creating that zone has had. I'm afraid I just don't know the answer. Yeah.
Actually, it's the 2014 CEDS was southeastern Vermont, and Laura Sibilia, if you get in touch with her, would be able to give you the best information on the impact. I'm pretty sure they got about $7 million out of the feds from it, and that it's widely regarded as successful. There's a Southern Vermont comprehensive economic development strategy that is being developed right now. They just went through their second round of public comments, and the next round of public comment and information is going to be November 14th and 15th, including a public meeting in Manchester. So if you check with Manchester Town Hall, they will be able to tell you when it is and how to show up. There's also a website which is very weirdly on the Southern Vermont Economic Summit website. Then there's a page that will take you to the 2019 Southern Vermont CEDS information.
Wow.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
How does Vermont track against the rest of the country with respect to opioid use?
I don't know. My gut reaction was to say that our situation is somewhat worse, but we are out of my element. Yes. Yeah. Does anyone know for certain? Okay. Yeah.
Just an observation, because
Sure.
we sit here and we talk about manufacturing jobs or highly skilled jobs. I think it's a job is a job, whether it's a dishwasher or an architect. And I think a real big problem is that we don't have enough workers to do these hospitality jobs. And that is really affecting our ability to drive the economy.
What's your first name?
Joy.
Joy. So Joy raises a really important point, because we talk about college students all the time, but in any capitalist economy, it's a pyramid, and the base workers they're not low skilled, but the position they have doesn't require a lot of skills, and they are always the base, and you always need a lot more low-skilled positions than high-skilled ones. And you need a labor force of people, both highly educated people and people who just want to work. And we need to provide opportunities for them to come here as well, because when we talk to employers, sometimes we hear, listen, I can't find an X-ray tech with a PhD in engineering. But far more often we hear, I can't find somebody to work in the back of the house at the
high
restaurant.
school jobs,
Yeah.
sell pizza.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you go to a pizza place, you can't find a high school
Right.
kid to work on Saturday night. I mean,
Yep.
It's really impactful.
It's a challenge. Yeah.
You said you might be willing to do some projections a little bit.
Yep.
Any thought 10 years from now how these demographics are going to work out? I mean, you show a lot of charts.
Yeah. So I'm not a policy person. So when I think about the demographics, I think policy can move the window dressing a little bit. But if you want to know what the population is going to look like in 10 years, what you really need to do is simply take the population we have now and move them all forward 10 years. Because that's what you're going to get. Age-wise. Age-wise, right. Because people aren't going to live that much longer 10 years from now. And the fertility rate's not going to change that much in the next 10 years. So we have all these discussions about in-migration and out-migration of people. And that impacts it, but it's window dressing compared to the demographics we've been handed, right? So I don't think first of all, people call it a demographic problem. I don't think it's a problem. It's just it's going to be that way in 10 years, and we need to prepare for it. And in some ways, we're a victim of our own success, because we live in a country that's created so much wealth that in 2018, people spend the first 20 or so years of their lives getting educated, and they spend the last 20 or 30 years of their lives, 20 years, whatever it might be of their lives, enjoying themselves. Like sometimes we have to pause and remember that is just completely unheard of in history in most places around the world, right? So then we talk about this like we have a problem now because there's too many retired people. Well, that's a great problem to have, right? Like that we've created that much. So anyway.
We're talking Vermont or even a little more the United States, but these fundamental demographic drivers, fewer and fewer people, working people, supporting more and more old people. I mean, that's a world, at least the developed world-wide phenomenon. I mean,
yes.
All the developed countries are facing the same basic.
Absolutely. Japan is facing it much worse than we are, right? But there's a partial solution, which is immigration, right? But, so anyway.
Yes, and just to pick up on the point that was being made, in fact, if you looked at the demographic statistics, the U.S. is not as far along in that phenomenon as many other industrialized nations in the world. You mentioned Japan.
Yep.
If you looked at the European countries and you looked at the population pyramid and projected what the U.S. population pyramid is going to look like, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, it's going to look like what Europe looks like today. And so perhaps we can learn from what other countries around the world have done well and what other countries around the world have not done so well.
Right.
In terms of policies that we might establish. And I guess that gets us back to the whole policy discussion.
Right.
As opposed to just the data discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Yep.
A couple of things suggested. I don't think it's the fertility rate is a problem, it's the production rate. But anyway.
Well,
secondly, the curve
I use the two interchangeably.
145%. Don't worry, all of us are getting older, but that will go away pretty soon as we start going.
Yes.
And thirdly, there's an old saying that if you build it, they will come, about the UVM students. If we have something for them here to do, make it worthwhile for them to stay, they will probably stay, but we don't have anything for them.
That's the need for the entrepreneurs to create opportunities. That's the businesses that I mentioned earlier. Right, yeah, and something like half of small businesses fail or something in the first year, but some of them become large businesses, right? And that's what we need. Yeah.
Hi. Again, I'm going to dovetail on what the gentleman just said, and I'm repeating myself again. We have a potential labor force who is spending millions, tens of millions of dollars to go to college here. And they choose to live here for 4, 5, 6 years. You moved from...
Yep.
Okay. What do they have, what is there to offer these folks once they graduate? Once they're handed their diploma, I mean, what do they do?
Well, that's the same thing. We need that. Vermont needs the entrepreneurs to create that, right? And
entrepreneurship is great. I mean, 2 or 3 people, we could all get together here and create some kind of something.
Yep.
But I guess my bigger point is, I mentioned earlier about your presentation, which was great. If you're not presenting this to the people who can change the policy, and I like my buddy right here, I have a house in another place as well. And that state has attracted businesses left and right. And they're clean business. They're not the smokestacks and any of that stuff. And it just seems like, I don't know who's responsible for it, the state of the economic development or whatever it is. But, unless you make these presentations to these folks and go, wake up, we're going to be in a world of trouble.
So I will say that amongst policymakers, the information I presented tonight is understood. Now, but we don't have anything to do with what they do with it, but that information is understood. People face this. And one example of a very successful economic development policy, decades, I guess, ago, we created a way to entice captive insurance here. And now we're one of the largest captive insurance industries. Now, it's not there's no one at UVM, there's not many kids at UVM going, I want to go into captive insurance. But it generates a lot of jobs in this state, and a lot of GDP is from captive insurance. There's a successful niche market that we filled. Policymakers are aware of these things and are trying to find solutions, but it's every other state's doing the same thing. Yeah.
What changed that caused the Census Bureau to be so far off on your projection?
The population projections? That's the first time I've ever been asked that. Why were they so wrong? I don't know. They obviously... I'd have to go look at the age cohorts, because you can look at it by age cohort. I'd be curious to see which age cohort they thought was going to grow so much. But in short, I don't know the answer to your question. Sorry. Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
Just a quickie, not to get political, but...
I won't, trust me.
No, but in fact, aren't you saying that looking at this, we need immigration?
All I'm saying is that if there's a shortage of workers, there are a couple ways to add workers. You can make more babies and wait 18 years, or you can bring people into your state from other places that have a surplus of labor.
But the state doesn't control borders, the national.
Right, yeah. So now somebody, yeah. I mean, that's one way to go about it. There's all sorts of reasons why we don't do that, but that is a a potential partial solution. And we do that. The refugee resettlement program in state brings in 300 people a year. So, in the Chittenden County area, it makes a difference, right? I think that number is going to be a little lower this year, but it still brings in people, and that's migration, net migration into the state. So, yeah. Any other questions before I? Yeah.
Just a quickie. The school population is going way down for 20 years, which is the thing that you talked about. Is there a potential that the colleges and their position on the graph as employers and so on is also going to take a nosedive?
Well, if you look around, the short answer is yes. UVM has continued to increase enrollment because they get such a large influence from out of state. The smaller colleges, you can look in the news, a lot of the smaller colleges are struggling because there's not enough young people right now. There were more young people 10 years ago, right? Nationwide than there are now college-age students. So colleges rode this wave of increased enrollment, and now they're struggling with that. So yeah, that's going to create a problem. Any other questions? Yeah.
Let's make this the last one.
Great.
Not really a question, but the person asked before about the opioid rates, and I Googled it from my phone here, and it shows that we have a 5.1% higher than the national average opioid rate.
Which state, does it say which state is the highest?
I didn't do that, I just did Vermont. So it looks like we have 110 deaths a year on average due to opioid use. So in 9 years, that would be 1,000 people. So if you can convert that a little bit, there's another 1,000 people for the workforce.
Yeah. So, and in sheer numbers, the employment levels are driven down both by people passing away, but also people who just can't function in a job.
5.1% higher than the national average.
Wow, okay, there you go.
And with that, we will thank you.
Thank you, Laura.